All right, so get ready, because today we are taking a deep dive into a place where engineering, ambition, and history, well, they all kind of collide. It's the Panama Canal.
Yeah, the Panama Canal.
It's that vital shipping route, the one slicing through Central America. But trust me, there's so much more to this story than just a shortcut between oceans.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a story that spans centuries. It's full of these daring attempts, tragic failures, and a whole lot of international intrigue. Like, honestly, it's got it all.
It really does. And to help us unpack all of this, I've got an expert with me today, so welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm really excited to dive into this one.
Me too.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. Why is the Panama Canal such a big deal?
Well, think about it for a second. Before the canal existed, ships had to travel all the way around South America just to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Yeah, that's not a quick trip.
Absolutely not. We're talking voyages that took months, like literally months at sea. It was a logistical nightmare, not to mention incredibly expensive.
So time, money, danger. I'm starting to get the picture.
Right, and that's why even back in the 1500s, when Spanish conquistadors first landed in Panama, they knew this narrow strip of land called the Panama Isthmus was going to be key.
Key to what? Exactly.
Well, faster, more efficient travel. I mean, they were all about transporting gold and silver back to Europe, right?
Ah, so the riches of the New World.
Exactly. They needed a way to get it all back home. And this isthmus, well, it held the key.
Okay, so I'm picturing these conquistadors waltzing across Panama with their treasure chests. No problem.
Haha, not quite. Their solution was a little less glamorous. It was called the Royal Road. And essentially, it was a mule trail hacking through the jungle.
A mule trail through the jungle.
That doesn't sound very efficient.
It was brutal. It was inefficient, but it did allow them to haul all that treasure back to Europe.
Okay. So not a luxury cruise, but hey, it got the job done. It proved that crossing that isthmus was at least possible.
Right. It was a taste of what was possible.
So when did the idea of an actual canal, a waterway for ships, start to gain some traction? Well, fast forward a few centuries and you have this booming era of global trade in the 1800s. Ships are getting bigger, trade is exploding, and suddenly that little Royal Road is looking pretty inadequate.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So in the 1850s, there's this ambitious attempt to build a transatlantic railroad across Panama.
A railroad through that jungle. That had to be a nightmare to build.
Oh, it was. American investors poured money into the project, but the challenges were immense. The terrain was unforgiving, accidents were frequent, and then you have diseases like yellow fever and malaria running rampant.
That's a recipe for disaster.
It was. Over 10,000 workers died during the construction of that railroad.
10,000. That's a staggering number.
It was a harsh reality check. Even with the railroad complete, it quickly became clear that it just wasn't enough. The dream of a canal, waterway capable of handling large ships, that dream persisted.
Okay, so enter Ferdinand de Lesseps. This is the French engineer who built the Suez Canal, right? He basically became a global celebrity.
Oh, yeah. De Lesseps was like the rock star engineer of his time. And his success with the Suez Canal, well, it created this frenzy of investment.
So everyone wanted a piece of the Panama Canal action.
Absolutely. Hundreds of thousands of people, everyday citizens, they poured their savings into this project. It was the hot stock to own. Everyone figured de Lesseps could do no wrong.
They were all ready to ride that wave of success all the way to the bank.
Right. Except this time it didn't quite work out that way.
It didn't. So what went wrong? These were the same engineers who built the Suez Canal. I mean, how could they fail so spectacularly?
Well, there were several fatal flaws. I think the biggest one was that they underestimated the challenges of the Panamanian terrain and climate.
What do you mean?
Well, the Suez Canal that was built through a relatively flat desert landscape. Panama, on the other hand, is mountainous. It's rainy. It's prone to landslides. They tried to apply the same formula to a completely different situation.
And that obviously didn't work.
It backfired big time. And to make matters even worse, they initially decided to build a lockless canal, meaning they tried to carve a channel directly through the mountains at sea level.
At sea level? Seriously?
It was incredibly difficult and expensive. It just wasn't feasible. But they were so sure they could replicate their Suez success that they just plowed ahead.
And I'm guessing disease also played a role here.
Oh, absolutely. Malaria and yellow fever spread by mosquitoes, they just ripped through the workforce. At least 20,000 workers died. And morale, well, you can imagine what happened to morale.
It plummeted.
Basically. And if all that wasn't enough, the project was also plagued by corruption and mismanagement.
So it was just a mess from top to bottom.
Pretty much. Funds were squandered. Even figures like Gustav Eiffel, the guy who built the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
He got caught up in the scandal.
Wow. So it was a financial disaster, a human tragedy, and a political nightmare.
It was a complete and utter collapse.
But as we all know, the story of the Panama Canal doesn't end there. This French failure set the stage for another global power to enter the game.
And that global power was determined to succeed where the French had failed.
Exactly. And that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive. So stay tuned because things are about to get really interesting.
So the French, they gave up on their dream of a Panama Canal. But, the whole idea of a canal through Panama, it didn't just disappear.
No, of course not. It was just too valuable of a prize. I mean, controlling that passage between the Atlantic and Pacific, that was huge.
It was strategically vital.
Right.
Especially for a rising power like the United States.
Right. The U.S., in the late 19th century, they had ambitions of their own. They wanted to expand their navy, facilitate trade, solidify their presence on the world stage.
And a canal through Panama. Well, that was key to achieving all of those goals.
Okay, but there was a slight problem. Panama was still technically part of Colombia.
You're right. They couldn't just waltz in and start digging.
So what did they do?
Well, at first they tried to play it by the book. They tried to negotiate a deal with Colombia for the rights to build and operate the canal.
Did Colombia bite?
They offered a significant sum of money. But the Colombian government, they were hesitant. Maybe they thought they could get a better deal.
So they said no.
They rejected the offer. And that's when things start to get a little... Well, let's just say the U.S. saw an opportunity.
What kind of opportunity?
There was growing unrest in Panama, a lot of Panamanians. They were already seeking independence from Colombia.
And the U.S. saw a chance to capitalize on that.
Let's just say they weren't exactly opposed to a little regime change.
So they backed a revolution.
When the revolution erupted in 1903, the U.S. just happened to have warships conveniently stationed off the coast of Panama.
Blocking any Colombian intervention.
You could say that the revolution succeeded. Panama declared independence, and suddenly the U.S. is their best friend, their protector, and of course they secured that sweet canal treaty.
So it was a power move, but a successful one.
And it was. The U.S. got what they wanted, and they were ready to get to work, but this time they knew they had to avoid repeating the French mistakes.
They had learned some hard lessons from that whole debacle.
Yeah, they couldn't just ignore the challenges of the Panamanian terrain and climate, and they definitely couldn't underestimate the threat of disease.
So how did they tackle those challenges?
Well, first, they brought in Dr. William Gorgas. He was a U.S. Army physician who had experience in controlling yellow fever and malaria.
Wait, wasn't he the guy who basically figured out how to wipe out yellow fever in Havana?
That's him. He implemented a comprehensive program in Panama. They drained swamps, fumigated buildings, distributed mosquito nets.
And it worked?
It made a world of difference. The incidence of yellow fever and malaria plummeted. They saved countless lives, and it allowed the project to move forward at a much faster pace.
So public health was just as important as engineering.
It was absolutely crucial. But even with disease under control, the construction of the canal was still a monumental task.
I can only imagine. All that digging, all that concrete.
It was a massive undertaking. They brought in top engineers like John Stevens and later George Goethals. They oversaw the excavation of millions upon millions of cubic yards of earth and rock.
So they basically moved mountains.
Pretty much. One of the most challenging parts was creating the Calibre cut.
The Calibre cut, that's that iconic image you always see of the canal with those massive ships passing through towering cliffs.
Exactly. It was a feat of engineering. They had to contend with landslides, unstable rock formations, constant flooding.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was. It was dangerous and backbreaking work. And even with the advances in disease control, there was still a significant human cost.
So workers still died.
Thousands of them. Many of them came from the Caribbean islands. They were drawn by the promise of work, but the conditions were often harsh, and there was widespread discrimination and exploitation.
It's a reminder that progress often comes at a price.
It does. But in 1914, after years of toil and sacrifice, the Panama Canal was finally complete. The first ship officially passed through. It was a triumph of human ingenuity. But it also marked the beginning of a new era, one filled with complexities and controversies.
Okay, so the U.S. had their canal, this engineering marvel, but they also kind of had this brewing problem, right? I mean, the Panamanian people, they weren't exactly thrilled about having this slice of their country under foreign control.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, the U.S., they saw the Panama Canal as this incredibly important asset, strategically speaking. And they weren't exactly shy about, throwing their weight around in the canal zone.
So they basically ran it like their own little territory.
Pretty much. They had their own government police force, even their own postal service.
Wow. So it was like a country within a country. I mean, how long could that possibly last?
Well, it led to decades of tension. As you can imagine, Panamanians, they wanted their country back. They wanted sovereignty. And their calls for independence, well, those only grew louder and louder over time.
So there were protests, I'm guessing.
Protests, riots, even violent clashes between Panamanians and U.S. forces.
It sounds like things were getting pretty heated.
They were. And the 1964 riots, those were a real turning point. More than 20 Panamanians were killed. Several U.S. soldiers died as well. It became clear that the status quo just wasn't sustainable.
So the U.S., they finally realized they couldn't just hold on to the canal forever.
Yeah, the writing was on the wall. There was growing recognition, even within the U.S., that Panama had legitimate grievances.
So they started negotiating with the Panamanian government.
Right. These negotiations went on for years. It was pretty intense, but eventually it led to the signing of the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977.
And those treaties essentially paved the way for Panama to regain control of the canal.
They did. It was a phased process. The U.S. gradually handed over different aspects of the canal's administration and operation.
Until finally, in 1999, the Panama Canal was fully back in Panamanian hands.
A truly historic moment. It was a celebration of Panamanian sovereignty and a recognition of their ability to manage this global asset, this vital waterway.
It's an incredible story of perseverance and ultimately, justice.
It is. But even with Panama in control, the story of the Panama Canal doesn't end there. It continues to evolve. And we can't really talk about the canal these days without mentioning China.
China? What's their role in all of this?
Well, in recent years, China has become a major player in Panama. They're investing heavily in infrastructure projects and securing control of key ports near the canal.
So they're increasing their influence.
They are. And they've also deepened diplomatic ties with Panama. Panama switched its recognition from Taiwan to China back in 2017.
I see. So the U.S. is watching all of this very carefully, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. There's concern in Washington about China's long-term ambitions in the region.
Some people even say that China might be interested in building a rival canal through Nicaragua.
Yeah, that's been floating around. Whether it actually happens, who knows? But it would certainly be a game changer.
It would. So the future of the Panama Canal is still kind of up in the air.
In a way, yeah. It's a reminder that this little strip of land, it continues to be a focal point of global power dynamics.
It's incredible to think about all the history that's unfolded in this one place. From the Spanish conquistadors to the French engineers to the American intervention, and now the rising influence of China. It's fascinating.
It really is. It's a story of ambition, innovation, and the ever-shifting tides of global power. And it's a story that's not over yet.
Not by a long shot. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. But before we go, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think the next chapter holds for the Panama Canal? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Yeah, what's your take on China's role in all of this? We're really interested to hear your perspectives.
We are. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history and the future of the Panama Canal. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.